Hi everyone, welcome back to English 229. This is for our class for Wednesday, the 4th of October, where I wanted to talk a little bit about Poe's short stories, also remind you about our first writing assignment. So I hope that you are thinking about possibilities for your first paper. And as you know, I've got a rolling deadline, so whenever you have your paper ready, you can submit it in, and you all have the option of doing a revision for it. That said, the sooner you get in the paper, probably the better for everybody involved. I just happened to choose a date that was midway through the semester. That's not to say that you couldn't submit it in past that date, but I do want to know what's going on if you haven't submitted it in by that date because, well, we're midway through the semester. You want to have some specific feedback about your writing, I would think, by that point. So where we are is getting ready to talk about Edgar Allan Poe and then ultimately transition to Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, another one of those iconic Gothic texts. In fact, if you ordered the text that I had suggested for our class, the one with an introduction by Stephen King, you will see that he paired Frankenstein, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, and Dracula, which are usually considered to be the three pivotal Gothic texts. As you know, 3 is such a significant number. From a literary standpoint, it's often suggestive of Trinity or unholy Trinity, as we will talk about when we get to Dracula. So Jekyll and Hyde is longer than Edgar Allan Poe's works, but not as long as Dracula. So the sooner you can begin Dracula, probably the better you are. That's the longest text of the semester. Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde being a novella, being that it's longer than a short story, so it's longer than Edgar Allan Poe's works, for instance. But it's not quite as long as a novel, something that we would have seen with Frankenstein, for instance. You'll also notice in the notes below that our Monday class happens to fall on Native Indigenous Day. So that means that we are not meeting as a class. I'll post something onto Moodle that also gives you a little bit of time to catch up. I'm hopeful that at this point you have finished Frankenstein in its entirety, and hopefully you've also finished Edgar Allan Poe in his entirety, and you are beginning, as I said, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, but just because of the way that the dates fall, you've got a little bit of time. And we'll also talk about film adaptation when we get to Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde as well. So I selected 4 Poe short stories that fit very nicely, I think, into the Gothic tradition. The Fall of the House of Usher, The Mask of Red Death, The Telltale Heart, and The Black Cat. And The Fall of the House of Usher might be the most challenging of the pieces. It's certainly the less clear of the pieces. And one of the things that that particular text examines is generational evil. It's never directly stated, it's merely implied or suggested. And the House of Usher also represents the genealogy of the family of Usher. In fact, it wouldn't have been unusual at the time for families of wealth and status to oftentimes associate that wealth and status with the family home. And that would be something that would be given from generation to generation. It also wouldn't have been unusual for generations to experience fall and descent once we have more modern times encroaching on the old system, and that we see as well. The season is autumn, which suggests descent and also the ending or the beginning of ending, but we also get that sense with Usher because there are no heirs, and the assumption is that there has been some sort of an ancestral relationship between brother and sister. It's one of the reasons for the disease and the decay and the element of needing to put right some sense of morality. One of the things I appreciate about Poe are his literary efforts, use of alliteration, for instance, the initial repetition of consonant sounds, which is the exact opposite of rhyme, where you've got the ending of sounds that have similar sounds. But notice how he talks about it's a dull, dark day. All of those D sounds that, of course, are suggestive of death. And already we get the setting of isolation. Our narrator is alone on horseback. the Usher house is isolated, and Roderick Usher is isolated as well. And as we will soon see, if we haven't already, isolation is usually a very bad thing in the world of the Gothic. Part of the morals or the lessons of horror and Gothic is that salvation occurs within community. Something we'll definitely see when we get to Dracula. The narration is first person in the eye, and this is something that is very typical of Poe. And of course, there is a certain subjectivity when you have the eye narrator, but we had also talked about the difficulty of not having an eye narrator always in Frankenstein, that although it sounded like Victor and the creature were narrating from the eye perspective, ultimately this was through the lens of Walton, which complicated matters somewhat. No, Edgar Allan Poe's use of personification, of giving inanimate objects human qualities. The house is described as if it's alive. This is something for us to consider when we get to a later text in the semester, The Haunting of Hill House. But the eye like windows. One theme you will notice with Poe is that he oftentimes references eyes. Eyes are supposed to be windows into the soul, the idea that the eye can see the truth, and these pieces are as much psychological as they are possibly supernatural. So the idea that one can hide the truth from the prying eyes of others, or even perhaps from oneself. On page 22, if you're using the edition that I had ordered of the text, the Dover edition, it talks about the sentience of all vegetable things, the idea that all inanimate objects might have some sort of consciousness associated with them. Poe oftentimes makes drug references, and if you know anything at all about Poe's biography, which we had briefly discussed, he was known for his drug use and abuse. So the drug references seem perhaps almost autobiographical, and how ultimately drugs can interfere with consciousness. The revealing of truth, the dropping of a veil, is something that I think we see in all four of these stories. And when we're talking about three, the trinity in this instance of brother, sister, and house. And I would suggest that, again, that's very deliberate in terms of talking about the house and the brother and the sister representing some sort of, well, unholy matrimony, if you wanted to think about it that way. Now, this generational and family evil is suggested through the unnatural sensations, the acuteness of the senses, and it would not have been unusual for families of certain status and wealth to intermarry among themselves so they could maintain that status and wealth. It oftentimes is something that is joked about, in fact, in terms of royal families. But we could see what happens when that's done to an extreme in the fall of the House of Usher. There also are references to psychological disorders such as hypochondria. The atmosphere is perfect for the Gothic tradition. We've got Gothic architecture with the House of Usher itself, as well as this idea of decayed trees and fungi, and even the description of Roderick Usher, the cadaverousness of complexion. It almost reminds me of the parallel with Frankenstein's creature, which of course Hollywood has taken liberties with. We learn about there being a Madeline Usher, who was a deceased twin sister, and this sense of twin or doppelganger. And we'll see this over and over again. We saw the idea of doubling in Frankenstein with Walton and Victor, perhaps with Victor and the creature. And certainly we see this idea of doubling again with Roderick and his sister. I very much appreciate the poetic elements. Perhaps Poe is best known for his poem, The Raven. A wonderful piece, that also is quite Gothic and also has elements of possible supernatural. If you know anything about the poem, it's a narrator who is lamenting his lost Lenore. And by the ending of the poem, it would seem that the narrator has been killed by the raven. But if that is indeed the case, who's narrating this poem? Which, of course, is a very Poe-like twist. But there is a poem that is, at least in the edition I had ordered, page 21, haunted palace, which I think serves as wonderful foreshadowing for the actual House of Usher itself. And a quote, "But evil things in robes of sorrow assail the monarch's high estate." This is something we will also see in The Mask of Red Death, about people with privilege who try to isolate themselves and the negative consequences of that. In terms of Poe and some of his fears of premature burial, which would not have been that unusual during the time period. There were even devices that were sold to notify the living in the event that one was buried prematurely and awoke in the grave. But Madeline is in that family vault. And think about, the idea of the buried secrets of family members through incest and all kinds of other intergenerational secrets. They'd come back to haunt you. So we can see Madeline as coming back literally, but we can also see the sins of the past from a symbolic perspective coming back to haunt you. And at the ending of the story, we have this sense of disintegration where the house literally falls apart. Certainly the family lineage has fallen apart. And the possible ambiguous ending that either this was a supernatural event or it was a figment of the narrator's imagination, which allows readers who don't want to necessarily embrace a supernatural explanation to find something that's more natural. Now, The Mask of Red Death is a story that I've been assigning for many years, but it occurred to me in 2020 when we were at the beginning of COVID, how applicable it was to COVID. The Red Death in The Mask of Red Death being disease and plague, and there is an old idea that blood is a representation of life. We see that within Christian tradition and iconography as well, and notice the Christian elements that are oftentimes embedded in these Gothic texts. And we have a Prince Prospero. Of course, that sounds like prosperous. He's happy, he's dauntless, he's also quite proud. Notice the P for Prospero, the P for Prince, and the P to suggest the idea of proud, and thinking that he can outwit death. No one can outwit death. And what we get in this story is a personification of the Red Death. Once again, we see this sense of attempting isolation and the negative consequences of that, going into deep seclusion and throwing a masquerade ball. In other words, hiding from reality. And I think about, again, COVID-19 and some of the times that we were all on lockdown. Of course, the atmosphere is quite Gothic. If you're familiar with Stephen King's The Shining, then you might be familiar with the Overlook Hotel and also some of the statements that are made within the Overlook, such as Unmask, Unmask. That is a definite reference to The Mask of Red Death. It's a way for Stephen King to pay a little homage to Poe. But we have 7 rooms, and 7 is so symbolic on so many levels. Of course, 7 could be seen as lucky or unlucky, however you wanted to view it. But of course, 7 is suggestive of the 7 deadly sins. And might I suggest that these revelers are perhaps engaging in all of the 7, and they will suffer the consequences. Sloth, lust, gluttony, greed, wrath, envy, pride, all exhibited on one level or another in their attempt to basically seclude themselves and hide from Mask of Red Death and ignore the pain and suffering of others. You can also think of this as the 7 life stages: infant, child, teen, young adult, adult, retirement, and then finally the elderly. And these could represent the stages of life as well. Even the colors, and all of the rooms are basically given a color so they can be differentiated from one another. Purple, green, orange, white, violet, and black. Perhaps these colors can be connected with the idea of sin, or perhaps these colors can be connected with the idea of life stage. But certainly when we get to the ebony clock, that's pretty clear that this is supposed to be a symbol for time, and time is presented as the enemy here. Midnight, which represents both ending and beginning, and of course is so appropriate from a Gothic tradition. And as that clock is ringing, again, if you are, or chiming, I should say, if you are aware of The Shining, then you're quite also aware of the chiming of the clock in the Overlook Hotel. And once again, we get personification of inanimate objects that basically seem to have some level of sentience. Definitely, we see that with the clock itself, the sense of darkness and decay. And dominion. Again, notice that alliteration. And once again, the ambiguous ending as the Red Death comes to collect. Is the Red Death merely just symbolic, or is the Red Death literal as it appears at the masquerade party and basically decimates everyone there? The Telltale Heart and the Black Cat are in some ways quite similar to one another. Yes, we have I narrators, which again is very typical of Poe. And the first word in the Telltale Heart is true. And that's really the major question of the text, is what is true and what is false. Once again, we get references to eyes, that eyes can see the truth. And of course, he's haunted by this eye. And what we've got basically is the confession of a madman. So we're able to see the interior workings of a mad person. And each time we have the madman verify or try to verify the fact that they're sane, that's merely additional proof of their insanity. Think about also some of the associations with the eye. For instance, the evil eye, a look that's capable of inflicting injury. And of course, in the Telltale Heart, the eye is reference to the vulture, a vulture being a bird of prey. Midnight, again, gives us that atmosphere. So already in just a few Poe short stories, you're beginning to see the repetition of language and the repetition of themes. Death, again, capitalized. Oftentimes, that's a way to personify something. The way that he dismembers the corpse is quite macabre, but we don't get gory details in the way we would with something like what Stephen King calls the gross out for a text like The Exorcist, which we will eventually be getting to, which is why I think that the Telltale Heart is oftentimes studied at the high school level, because it's gory but not too graphic. The police represent the moral authority. And basically, again, think about how the heart is a symbol, and that you can't hide the truth, no matter how much you try to embed it within your heart. This is a beating heart that seems to haunt our narrator, whether, again, it's a figment of his imagination or it just happens to be some sort of a supernatural entity. We know that the more that he tries to hide his crime, the more obvious it is that he is the murderer. Again, something that we will see also in the Black Cat. And that possible ambiguous ending with the Telltale Heart, and whether there is indeed a beating heart beneath those floorboards. When we get to the Black Cat, think about some of the symbolism associated with the superstitious idea of black cat, that black cats are supposed to represent evil, though that also is culturally determined. In some cultures, it's the white cat that represents evil. In Egypt, though, the cat is viewed as a kind of sacred symbol, something to be worshipped. We get an I narrator who's an alcoholic. In this instance, we learn about the evil of drug use and abuse, not necessarily opium in this instance, but alcohol. And when we get to Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, it's definitely been read as a parable for drug use and abuse. And the confession that we get before the execution, one thinks that one would tell the truth before they're being executed. In the gallows, no less, it seems to be an appropriate execution once we hear the details of all of the sordid sins this narrator has committed under the influence of alcohol. The narrator maintains that it's alcohol's fault, but of course we understand that that's merely escapism, and it merely is a way to justify his actions. He says that intemperance is his evil, that he's lost reason and engaged in self-destruction and meaningless violence because of it. And perhaps we could say that alcohol is the impetus for those actions, but of course he makes the decision to drink that alcohol. Notice some of the mythical references that we will see in authors such as Edgar Allan Poe. Pluto, the name of the cat. Pluto is the Roman god of the underworld and the lord of death. Again, sort of establishing the mood and the theme. Again, he's haunted by an eye, ability to see the truth. And on page 110, or at least of the version that I had ordered on page 110, it talks about the idea of the forbidden and about the temptation to commit a vile action purely because one should not. And this perhaps goes back to the idea of Stephen King and talking about the attraction of horror and Gothic, is that it allows us to engage in the deviant, albeit in a safe way. But I think it also is an illustration of Poe's wonderful understanding of human psychology. The idea of the roped cat, that has supposedly imprinted an image through a fire. Of course, fire is suggestive of hellfire, which is eventually where this narrator will be, one assumes. With the second cat, doppelganger, this idea of doubling, happens to be eyeless with a white splotch, the white perhaps suggestive of some possibility of justice here. The nonchalant way that the narrator talks about axing his wife, again, with enough detail to intrigue a high school audience, but not so much detail as to perhaps make it inappropriate for a high school audience. And burying the wife in the cellar walls, the buried secrets behind the walls. And once again, we see police as moral authority. This time we see this idea of premature burial, that the cat has not necessarily been killed, at least the second cat, but the ending is ambiguous enough so there is at least the possibility of some sort of a supernatural entity that is basically releasing the secrets of our guilty narrator. But of course, we could also say that it's just his psychological guilt that makes him ultimately feel the need to confess. So that gives you a little bit of an idea of Poe's 4 short stories. And I thought what we could do, I've asked lots of questions about Poe. One of the questions I've asked in the past is, which story did you like the least and why? But it strikes me that it might be more interesting for you to identify a quote within one of Poe's 4 short stories, whether it be The Fall of the House of Usher, whether it be The Mask of Red Death, whether it be The Telltale Heart, or whether it be The Black Cat, and talk a little bit about why it's important, just because of Poe's ability to use language in such poetic and interesting ways. So I think that'll be the attendance question for today. That would be due on Friday the 6th, but certainly if you need additional time, you can let me know, and I can grant you an extension. So you're not necessarily required to respond to your peers, but you are required to read their responses and my responses in turn. And who knows, perhaps those discussion forum responses might help motivate you to come up with a paper topic. So I've come up with a paper topic about the idea of one need not be a physical structure to feel haunted, from Emily Dickinson. But you can come up with your own topic, just as long as you approve the topic by me and you're ultimately referencing one of the texts that we are discussing over the first part of the semester. So that probably means Frankenstein, or one or perhaps a couple of Edgar Allan Poe's works. Edgar Allan Poe is a little bit different because we're working with a short story. So talking about a short story is different than a novel. But I would think that talking about more than 2 of Poe's short stories might become a little bit overwhelming. If you are going to write a 4 or 5 page paper. That was merely my suggestion in terms of length. Of course, you could write more, you could write less. And as we were talking about some of the conventions of writing, that you want to try to be as concise as possible. So length comes from argument, not necessarily from language that is not needed. So one of the things you want to try to do when you're going through your writing is to read through each sentence in turn and see if you can rewrite that sentence in a more concise fashion. And if you can do so, then probably 9 out of 10 times that's a stronger sentence, even though that means that you have less in terms of length. But again, length should come from argumentation. And of course, the text that's coming up, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, is a wonderful opportunity as well to write a paper on. My suspicion is that Dracula would probably be a better text for your second paper rather than for your first paper, because I doubt we'll have much of an opportunity to talk about Dracula before we hit the midpoint of the semester, which is really the goal date for submitting in a paper. But I encourage you to submit in a paper earlier rather than later. So as you can see, we're at the point of the semester now where I'm beginning to push a little bit in terms of the paper assignment. And of course, if you have any questions or concerns, reach out to me. But we'll put some closure onto Edgar Allan Poe when we meet again, which will not be on Monday because that's Native Indigenous Day, but it'll be on Wednesday. And then we will begin to talk about, well, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. So I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well, and we will continue on next class. And I look forward to reading the quotes you select. Take care. Bye-bye.